We're there with a Christian friend. And at this barbecue, there's burgers, there's hot dogs, and there's also beer in the cooler at the end of the table. So you can serve yourself burgers. I grab myself a burger, I grab myself a hot dog, and then I reach into that cooler for a beer. But then my Christian friend says to me, Alden, I don't know if you're allowed to have alcohol. I don't know if it's biblical for us to drink alcohol. I'm not sure you should do that. In some ways, this is a small moment, right? In some ways, it feels minor, doesn't seem like much, but we're going to find in our passage, God actually cares a lot about how I interact with my Christian brother or sister in a moment like that. He cares a lot about how I treat my fellow Christian in a moment like that. So let's read this passage and see what God has to say. Romans chapter 15, starting in verse 1. If you're using one of the Pew Bibles, it's on page 893. Romans chapter 15, verses 1 through 7. Romans chapter 15, verse 1 reads this. We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another, in accord with Jesus Christ, that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. Well, friends, the main idea of our passage is simply this. Let's live selflessly and in unity. Let's live selflessly and in unity. There's two parts to that idea, the selfless piece and the unity piece. And those correspond to the two sections of our text this morning. Verses 1 through 4 describe the call to live selflessly because Jesus did. And then verses 5 through 7 give us the call to live in unity because it glorifies God. So live selflessly and live in unity. Let's look in this first part of our sermon passage. Live selflessly because Christ did. We see from the outset that our text talks about two categories of people. And if you've been with us in our sermon series through chapter 14, these categories will be familiar to you. But if you haven't, that's great. I'm glad you're here. We're going to get everybody on the same page here. So, the strong and the weak, who are they? The strong are those people who understand rightly their Christian freedoms. They understand what the Bible allows them to do, whereas the weak Christians, they do not understand their Christian freedoms. They think of themselves as more restricted than actually God makes them. So, for example, what we saw in chapter 14 is that the strong recognize that they're free from the Sabbath day regulations that the Old Testament put on the Old Covenant. The weak people, though, they're not comfortable with that. They say, no, I think we still need to observe that Sabbath day. We're not free in that way. Also in chapter 14, we see the strong recognize we're allowed to eat meat. We're permitted to do that. The Bible doesn't require we abstain from that. The weak category, they don't get that. They think, for example, no, we're not allowed to eat meat. We're not free to do that. There's a number of different ways that this manifests. The issue of, can Christians eat bacon? right? We are permitted, the New Testament allows us to do that, but some people aren't willing to accept that freedom. We're permitted, for example, to drink alcohol in moderation, but some don't feel comfortable, some aren't, we don't understand that, right? So that's the difference between the strong and the weak. The strong know their Christian freedoms. The weak do not understand those Christian freedoms. Now, this language of strong and weak, we've mentioned this before, but it's worth saying again, this is not intended to communicate shame for people who don't completely understand their freedoms. In fact, in chapter 14, verse 5, Paul actually says, perhaps surprisingly, hey, look, let everybody be convinced in their own mind with regard to these freedoms. If you're in the weak category, it's okay for you to be there, actually. Each of you should be, as you're convinced, operate the way your conscience is comfortable. Now look, on the other hand, there is a reality. I mean, the names strong and weak do indicate who's right or wrong, right? But if you're weak, there's no shame in that. And Paul insists on that, and we should do the same. It's okay for you to be there. If anything, the shame is on the strong Christians, so-called, if we, the strong Christians, impose our liberty on people at their expense. That's the real shame in this passage. That's what Paul is confronting in our text. So he says, we who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. Again, there's no shame. In fact, this is a loving passage toward those who are, quote, weak in their community in Rome. So Paul puts himself in the strong category, right? He understands his Christian freedoms, but that's not a ground for boasting. That's not a ground to be comfortable in our title or something. No. In fact, it's a call for us to serve others, is what he said. We owe it to them. We're not supposed to please ourselves. We should live to please others. We should live to please them. After all, just because we are allowed to do something doesn't necessarily mean we should do something all the time, right? We should aim to please our fellow Christians and not ourselves. Now, you might hear this language of pleasing others, and it might make you think of people-pleasing, right? When we think of people-pleasing, we think of someone who cares too much about what others think and bends over backwards to gain people's approval. And that is, we're right to guard against that. That's not what Paul has in mind here. He's not encouraging us to be people-pleasers in that kind of an unhealthy way. What Paul is saying is that our actions should not benefit us while harming others. Our actions should benefit others, even if at our own personal expense. So when the rubber meets the road, in that example where I'm at the barbecue and I reach for a beer and a fellow Christian says to me, Alden, I don't know about that. Okay, that's the strong-weak dynamic, right? I know my Christian liberty, maybe they don't, and that's okay. But in that situation, I'm the one at fault if I just go for it anyway. Oh, you know what? You don't understand your Christian liberty, brother. You know what? Watch and learn. Here's to freedom. If I do that, I'm sinning against my brother or sister. I'm sinning. And that is what Paul is warning against. That's not how we go about this. Paul's saying, hey, look, strong Christians, you who know your freedoms, don't hurt others with your freedoms. That's not what your freedoms are for. Let go of your freedoms to build up that brother or sister. Chapter 14, verse 15, just a few verses above our passage, Paul says, look, if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you're no longer walking in love. Our mission, right, is not to convince people of what liberties they have. Our mission is to love our neighbor. We owe it to them. Let's not grieve them by what we do. Now, it's important that we understand exactly what Paul is talking about and what Paul is not talking about. Because passages like this, and this one in particular, have been misused to, in short, prevent our obedience to God, and that's not good. So it's important to recognize Paul is talking very specifically about things we are permitted to do. Things we're permitted to do. But he's not talking about things we are commanded to do in this passage. So there's difference between what we're just allowed to do generally and what we're commanded to do specifically. Here's why I say this. If someone is offended by our obedience to God's commands, they do need to deal with that. We need to keep obeying God, right? So if someone says, hey, it's offensive that you go to church. I don't think you should go to church. That offends me that you go to church. As lovingly as we can, we're going to say, you know what? I'm actually going to keep going because God commands me to do that. Don't neglect to gather together, Hebrews tells us. Or even the way we do church, perhaps. Hey, you know what? The Bible has some offensive stuff to me. I'm offended by the Bible. I think you should stop preaching the Bible. And this passage tells you should stop doing that because I'm offended. Well, actually, Paul commands Timothy, he commands church to operate in this way. Preach the word. That's a command. And so we're not allowed to just undo God's commands, right? That's what we're after. If someone's offended that you go to work for whatever reason, you shouldn't stop going to work. God tells you it's good to work, right? So we're not talking about commands here. We're talking about freedoms. So if there's a command, they need to deal with our obedience to commands. But if it's a matter of freedom, just something we're allowed to do, but we don't have to do, now we need to deal with that. So that's the difference. Alden, I don't think you're allowed to eat meat. All right, I guess I'm not getting meat in front of you. That's cool. I'm not commanded to eat meat, so I'm going to love you but not eating meat. Alden, I don't think you're allowed to drink alcohol. I think you have to observe a Sabbath day. All right, I'm just not going to do those things in front of you, right? I'm not commanded to do that in a particular way. So that's an important difference for us as we approach this passage. We're talking about permissions, not commands. Now, honestly, this is not the easiest thing to do when the rubber meets the road. When there's something that I want to do, when there's something that I'm free to do, I don't want to not do it, right? Like, I want to do it. It feels restrictive. Perhaps, honestly, it might feel annoying or frustrating that people are kind of getting in the way of our liberties, right? Honestly, especially, I wonder for us as people who live in America, where freedom is given such a high value, I think it's pretty unnatural for us to be selfless like this. So, what motivates this kind of selflessness? What motivates us to treat our neighbor this way? There's a number of reasons, but verse 3 gives us one answer here. Verse 3 says, "For Christ did not please himself." It goes on, but let's pause there for a moment. Christ did not please himself. Christ was selfless toward us so that we could then in turn be selfless toward others. That's the motivation for our selflessness. You know, really, Jesus' entire earthly life was marked by selflessness. The fact that he became a man in the first place, he didn't have to do that, certainly not for his own benefit. The suffering he endured throughout his life, the dishonor that he endured, and then climactically, the suffering that he experienced on the cross. And what makes all of that selfless is that Jesus did that for himself? No, not for himself, for us. Jesus did all that for us, not for himself. Jesus did not please himself by becoming a human and dying the death that he died. He pleased us. It didn't benefit Jesus by becoming a man. It benefited us that Jesus became a man. You see, we had a problem. Without Jesus, we would be stuck in our sin and doomed to our death. That's the human condition apart from Christ, stuck in sin and doomed to death. But Jesus selflessly did something about that. He became a human. He took that condition upon himself. He took our sin. He took our death. And what he gave us in exchange was his righteousness and his life. Talk about selfless. He gets our garbage and we get his glory. That is a selfless exchange. That is a selfless exchange. And in verse 3, with this quotation from the Old Testament, there's a particular aspect of Jesus' death and Jesus' crucifixion that Paul zooms in on, the aspect of reproach. The word reproach is just the word insult. Jesus took shameful insults, right? So verse 3 continues, as it is written, quote, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. So this is a quote from the Old Testament, and specifically the book of Psalms, Psalm chapter 69, verse 9. And Psalm chapter 69 is a prayer of David, as many of them are. And in this prayer, David is expressing to God his affliction. He's expressing the shame he has from reproach, and he's expressing that he's being threatened with death. So that's the immediate context of Psalm 69. But it's worth knowing that the New Testament actually refers to this psalm many times, at least 7 times, perhaps more. And this, although it is an expression of David's life, in retrospect, we read it and we can see, actually, this anticipates a lot of Jesus' life, especially Jesus' sufferings. And so it does that in many ways. It anticipates a lot of different aspects of Jesus' life. I encourage you, if you're looking for like a quiet time content, Psalm 69 would be great to look through, and I think you'll be able to see some ways it anticipates Jesus' life. We're not going to go through the whole thing now, but for what that's worth. But the way that Paul is picking this up in our passage is the aspect of reproach and insult that Jesus took. This is a major theme in Psalm 69. The word reproach occurs 6 times, dishonor a handful of other times. But in Psalm 69, verse 7, for example, it reads this. This is kind of representative of the psalm. It is for your sake, David prays to God, that I have borne reproach, that dishonor has covered my face. And so David is being reproached because these people who are reproaching him are actually just enemies of God. And so inadvertently, as king, as the representative of God's people, David, he's bearing that reproach. Because they're attacking God, it lands on him. Well, that theme finds its fulfillment in Jesus, who would experience that same reproach on the cross. People who did not worship God, and in fact, reproached God. They did reproach God. Jesus is God. And he took those reproaches on the cross. You know, when I was preparing for this sermon and wrestling with this passage, I kind of found myself wondering, I wonder why the theme of reproach, the theme of insult, I wonder why Paul's making such a big deal about it. Like, aren't there other kind of more substantial aspects of the crucifixion to think about? Maybe Jesus' physical death, maybe his physical suffering, maybe the alienation he experienced from his fellow disciples, or the alienation from his father on the cross. Or, there's a lot of things. I felt like, I wonder why he's leaning into this. But as I thought about it a little more, I found, man, this is actually a pretty major theme in Jesus' crucifixion experience, is that he gets insulted. Here's a few passages. I think these will be sobering for us. This is how people treat God having become a man. Matthew 26. Then they spit on his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" That's reproach. John 19. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. This is a mock coronation ceremony. That's what this is. They're mocking him. And they came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. This is reproach. Luke 23. The people stood by watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself. If he's the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. It is so unfitting. It is so inappropriate. It is so wrong that Jesus, who is God himself, would experience this kind of reproach. That is so wrong. It's so backwards. He is God. He deserves to be glorified. He deserves to be honored and revered and worshiped and praised. He's the maker of the universe. He's the maker of the people who are reproaching him. He does not deserve to be treated like a criminal. He does not deserve to be treated sarcastically. He does not deserve to be slandered. He does not deserve to be bullied. Of all people, he does not deserve that. And yet he was. It is a selfless exchange. We deserved to be in his spot, not him. He was selfless by taking that position for us so that we wouldn't have to. And friends, if he did it for us, if that's how far Jesus went for us, let's do it for each other, right? If the God of all glory became a reproach for us, then goodness, we who are strong, we can serve those who are weak. This is an argument from greater to lesser. He is our example. He is our motivation. Let's do what he did. So, to summarize where we've been so far, the call is be selfless, like Jesus was, like the Old Testament said he would be, right? Be selfless, like Jesus was, like the Old Testament said he would be. And now in the next verse, Paul gives us an explanation for why he quotes the Old Testament in the first place. If you look with me in verse 4, Paul explains, "For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction." And that whatever was written in former days, that's the Old Testament. So the Old Testament was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Old Testament scriptures, we might have hope. I emphasize that Paul is talking about the Old Testament because when he was writing this, there was no New Testament yet. He's writing that New Testament as he writes, right? So the scriptures are the Old Testament here. So the Old Testament was written, this is the argument Paul's making in verse 4. The Old Testament was written so that we may have hope. So we may have hope. You see that? Whatever was written is so that we may have hope. And that is why Paul quotes from it. He even says, whatever was written. So whatever's in that Old Testament, the whole thing from beginning to end, this is how that Old Testament works. It gives us hope, and specifically hope in Jesus. After all, Jesus is the subject of Paul's discussion here. And it is because the Old Testament gives us hope in Jesus that Paul can use Psalm 69 to describe Jesus' death. He knows what the Old Testament is for. It points us to Jesus who gives us hope. And in this case, that hope is connected to Jesus' death, as it so often is. And because his death was a hopeful death. It was hopeful. It's hopeful for us. He died in our place. He experienced the shameful death that we deserve so that we can live an honorable life with him. that he deserved, that he has given us. That's our hope, is that honorable eternal life with Jesus. And that's what the Old Testament points us to. And it's intentional that Paul brings up hope in this context. At first, I a little bit wondered, how does hope fit in this context? I think here's how. We really need hope if we're going to be genuinely selfless, don't we? We need hope to be selfless because if all we're living for is this life, right here, right now, then this is all we got. We're going to hold on to every liberty that we have. We're going to use it. We're going to milk it for all it's worth. Because this is all we're living for if we have no hope. But as hopeful Christians, we know that that's not the reality. We know that this is not all we live for, is this life right now. No, we look forward to an eternity of joy. We look forward to an eternity of satisfaction, where Christ will be the fulfillment of literally every desire we've ever had. Man, that is way more meaningful. That is way more fulfilling than any freedom we have in this life. Again, the argument goes from greater to smaller. It is a small thing. For example, to give up a beer when I have eternity in mind. Hope enables us to live selflessly. Now look, hope does not solve all of our problems in the here and now. That's not what it does. Don't get me wrong, all our problems will be solved on that last day when Jesus comes back. He will put away sin, he will put away death. Our problems will literally be fully and finally resolved. We look forward to that. That's not our reality yet, though. We're waiting for that, right? So in the meanwhile, hope focuses us in the midst of the difficulties of life, in the midst of our problems. And that's what the Old Testament scriptures are for. They give us, verse 4, endurance, and they give us encouragement. Because while we're waiting, life does get difficult, and we need our hope to be fostered. We need an eternal perspective so that we can love our neighbor well. So friends, in light of this hope, in light of the hope that Psalm 69 describes, in light of the hope that the whole Old Testament describes, let's live selflessly because Christ did. Let's do that. So we've seen the importance of selflessness, and now for the second part of our passage, we see the importance of living in unity. And we find specifically we're called to live in unity to glorify God. We're called to live in unity to glorify God. Verse 5 reads this: May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another, in accord with Jesus Christ. From the outset, let's notice a parallel between verses 4 and 5. Endurance and encouragement that we saw in verse 4, we find in verse 5, God is the source of that endurance and encouragement. He provides that for us. It comes from God. He gives us these things. And he gives these things to us so that we can live in harmony with one another. In harmony with one another. So this phrase, live in harmony, this is a reference to, the word represents it's a mental harmony, a harmony of thinking. It's a unity of mind that it's getting at. So we're called, in our passage here, to a unity of mind together. And it's no coincidence that Paul just got done encouraging us to be selfless, and only then does he call us to unity. I say that because if our goal is unity, if unity is where we want to head, selflessness is how we're going to get there. It's kind of, selflessness is the ingredient of unity. Here's some examples that I've experienced in our church where selflessness has led to unity, both when I've received selflessness from many of you and when I've had opportunities to give selflessness to some of you. So when I first moved to Boston, many of you selflessly helped me move in to my apartment. And I was really a little surprised by how many strangers helped me move into my apartment. And that really encouraged me. And that made me be like, man, all these strangers, more people. When I moved, I love my Amherst friends. I moved from Amherst. I was there for 10 years. There were like 3 times as many people from Ruggles helping me move in than there were people in Amherst who helped me move out. I was like, man. Anyway, that's not a diss, really. That's just to compliment you, okay? But I was like, wow, I really want to get to know these people, but I want to press into life with them. They're selfless toward me. Selflessness promoted togetherness. It promoted unity for me. That was my experience. Another example is, in our church, I've found that a lot of people don't have cars. And so I own a minivan. I can drive 8 people at once. And so that's been an opportunity for me to give some, in a small degree, selflessness, give people rides, places. And I've noticed after doing this for the past year or so, a lot of really wonderful conversations happen in the car. Like there's bonding time that happens in those 20 minutes where I'm dropping someone off to their apartment. And man, sometimes I'll park in front of the apartment and we're still kind of talking about life, so the car just stays idling on the side of the road for another 30 minutes because we're talking, it's good stuff, We're enjoying each other. We're experiencing unity together. Selflessness promotes unity. It fertilizes the soil of unity, if you will. That's what selflessness does. It leads us to unity. And friends, this is just as true when it comes to our Christian freedoms. If we are selfless toward our weak fellow Christians, and we forego the freedoms that we are entitled to, then the weak Christians will feel comfortable hanging out with strong Christians. They'll feel respected and loved and cared for and honored. We'll see strong Christians selflessly foregoing their freedoms. We'll see weak Christians welcomed as equals because they are equals, because they're Christians. And we Christians, whether strong or weak, whether Jew or Gentile, whether this or that, we're all one in Jesus, together as a united whole. There's no rank. There's no superiority. We're one. And we live out that oneness by being selfless, just like Jesus was. So, we've seen selflessness leads to unity, but we might ask, what are we unified for? What's the purpose of our unity? What is our unity aiming at? Verse 6 gives us that answer. In short, verse 5, be unified. Verse 6, so that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. You know what the goal of our unity is? You know what the purpose of our unity is? It's God's glory. That's what we're aiming for in being unified together. God is glorified by our unity. There are many reasons for this, but one of them, when we are unified, we are representing God. We're showing who He is. Here's what I mean. God is the God of peace and harmony and oneness. In short, God is the God of unity. And so we are representing Him as He is when we, His church, Ruggles, and any church, when we show ourselves as one, we are showing the world who our God is. We display Him. We show off His glory. Now we should notice, kind of bigger picture, the command for unity does not require that weak Christians become strong. That's not the unity that God is commanding us to here. That's not the unity that God has in mind. Now, I'll grant you, these freedoms that God has given us, God has communicated those on purpose, right? It's not like God just wants those ignored. And so, in a certain sense, it would be better for all Christians to be strong in that regard, to have an understanding of what we're allowed to do, right? So sure, that's true. But nevertheless, The unity that God has in mind here is much deeper than we're all on the same page about our Christian liberties. It's much bigger than that. You see, what God is most concerned about is that we worship him as one people together. That's what God is after here. Verse 6, that together you may with one voice glorify God. The goal of our unity is unified worship to God's glory. That's the goal of our unity. And we can worship unified even if we disagree about the Sabbath day, or about alcohol, or about bacon. That's small beans, right? And we can worship God together. Therefore, verse 7, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. Okay, as Christ has welcomed you. How has Christ welcomed us? Completely, entirely, fully, with his whole self. He didn't hold back. He offered his whole life to welcome us into eternal fellowship with him. He has been completely selfless toward us so that we could be totally united to him. So let's be selfless to one another so we could be united to one another. You know, if you're here and you wouldn't consider yourself a Christian this morning, I want to invite you to consider how selfless Jesus was toward you by dying on the cross to offer a relationship to you. Jesus desires eternal fellowship with you to such a degree that he would go to the cross for it. That's selflessness. There's no greater selflessness than what Jesus demonstrated on the cross. And so whatever you're longing for, whatever you desire in life, Jesus is the greatest fulfillment of all of that. And I invite you to take him up on that. Believe in him, trust in him, receive his selfless sacrifice, and enjoy him forever. Come be a part of this selfless, unified church that God has died to create. Come be a part of that. You're invited. You're invited. This word welcome, maybe this is just pointing out the obvious, but this word welcome does not mean to tolerate. It means welcome, right? We're not just called to deal with one another. We're called to pursue one another intentionally. So for example, you want to go to a bar? Okay, but you know the so-and-so will be uncomfortable with that, but they'd love to hang out with the group if that wasn't what the group was doing. Don't go to the bar. And invite them to join you, whatever else you're doing instead. But really welcome them. That's what I mean. This is not a call to toleration. Like, we avoid them. We kind of hang out on the side. No, let's welcome one another. Let's purposefully pursue involvement together. Not at one another's expense, but for the sake of love. You know, by extension, our passage is talking about things explicitly permitted. And so taking a step beyond that, I think there's still implications for many aspects of life. Nevertheless, let's say you disagree with someone about politics. That's okay. You don't have to vote with them. You don't have to debate them. But you do have to worship with them. You do have to be willing to have them over for dinner. Hear about their life and encourage them and do real meaningful life with them. We do have to really welcome them. Friends, no matter what the issue is that we're talking about, whatever the relatively petty differences there are between us, let's live selflessly. And let's live in unity. To use the language of verse 7, let's welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God.